Hey guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and this is the video that is going to be both an introduction to our unit we're starting now, the Issues novel, and also a description, a little bit of background of A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, this first novel you're reading by Alice Childress in the Issues novel unit. So I want to talk about the context of the unit in general, and then a little bit of background about A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich specifically. There's some of this stuff that that goes along with this that we're going to get to in more detail when we get to the YA literature unit at the end of the semester. That, about teenagers and the development of teenagers and things like that. But so there's some of it that I'm going to skip over for now. But we'll go into a little bit to give you some context for the Issues novel unit. So if you, just a recap of the chronology of the class so far, we had been going in chronological order. We took a little bit of a break with the fairy tales unit and the picture book unit. Those weren't really in any sort of chronological place in the timeline of children's literature. We took a little bit of a break, and then we had presentations too. But if you remember, just to review, in the course so far, we had started with the early beginnings with some of the first things written for children, those early alphabet books, the little horn book on the paddle thing, and the little folded up battledores, and the chat books, and the little nursery rhyme stories, and also Sunday school stuff like and Pilgrim's Progress and the little readers and stuff, and moved on into the more established educational texts like the primers, the New England Primer and the Pretty Little Pocketbook and things like that. And moved on into the sort of dawn of the children's literature market, I guess you could say, making it where it's an actual field genre of children's literature in 1744 with Pretty Little Pocketbook. And that allowed for, over the next century after that, to create this sort of boom in children's literature, which became the golden age of children's literature in the mid 1800s up through about the 1920s, where there was lots and lots of books being written for children. It was a big success. It was taken more seriously. Serious authors wrote things for children. They were considered literature, right? And the subjects became more complex. And not only were they more complex and commercially successful, but if you recall, much with the aid of Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, the sort of the market and the culture started to see books for children as being able to be entertaining. Not that they weren't amusing and entertaining before, but the primary focus for them was to be, educational. As I mentioned the word didactic before for us, in class, very educational. So, with the golden age and sort of the mid 1800s, children's literature became to be something more entertaining, and we had this boom of the golden age up through the 1920s. That's really kind of where it tapered off. Mary Poppins came out in the 1920s, those books, and those were kind of toward the end, and Winnie the Pooh sort of toward the end there. And so there's a lot of historical and cultural reasons why it makes sense why the field of children's literature sort of tapered off for a little while, starting in the 1920s. And then the world was kind of in upheaval at that point. If you think about it, World War I had just ended. I think 1919 is when World War I ended, if I'm remembering my world history correctly. But it was right around in there sometime. And then we had major economic depression throughout the 1920s and 30s. And then we had another World War, World War II, started in 1939, from 1939 to 1945. So we had a few decades of just uncertainty and upheaval and economic distress, and people weren't buying books, and people weren't concerned with literature. People weren't concerned with what kids were reading, and it was just what could they eat and where could they live, and making sure they stayed healthy. 1918 is also when there was that massive flu pandemic that wiped out millions of people worldwide, and so they were kind of more worried about other things besides creating and reading books for children. So it makes sense. But after the war, the post-war, both World Wars period, it's sort of known in history as this peaceful, progressive, prosperous time. The 1950s, basically. Think of the 1950s aesthetic you've seen in movies, like sock hops and soda jerks and the drive-ins and things like that. So you had the Leave It to Beaver era, where you had the mom who was at home and all the men were home from war, and we kind of regained this sense of normalcy where men did men things and women did women things. Women weren't working in factories anymore, and we had this sort of, and that might be an illusion, this sort of domestic bliss that we associate with the 1950s. And in hindsight, that was probably not an accurate depiction of how everybody lived, but that's sort of the cultural dominant image that we have of this post-war prosperous time. And so this was the first generation of teenagers who were living in this leisurely time. A reason why teenagers had so much free time was because of advances in education. We'll talk more about this when we get to the teenager young adult unit, but by this time, by the late 1930s and early 1940s, public high schools were being instituted, and it was mandated that teenagers up to a certain age had to be in school. And so for the first time, you had all these teenagers who weren't working, they weren't adults yet, they were teenagers, and so they had free time, and they had sort of disposable income, because there were like part-time jobs they were allowed to have, but they couldn't work full-time. And then their parents gave them some money because everybody was prosperous and having feeling optimistic after the wars. And so I bring this up because you had all these teenagers in the 50s and 60s who were very unsupervised because their parents had never been supervised when they were their age. They were already adults by then, right? And so we had this teenage culture that arose in the 1950s and 60s where they were just kind of on their own, hormones raging, they could drive, they had some money to spend, enough to get in trouble, and they weren't really supervised in any real way by their parents. They were considered to be kind of grown by then. So as you can imagine, shenanigans ensued. So that's where we get, if you think of what the 50s are known for, which we already talked about, think of what the 60s are known for. The 60s are known for free love, hippies, drug use, rampant drug use, rampant sex, the spread of STDs, all these different things, this sort of hippie movement of the 1960s. And so I think the sort of youth counterculture of the 1960s and into the 70s, but mostly the 60s is what we're talking about when it first emerged. I think it really caught the sort of middle-aged generation of the time off guard. It kind of caught them off guard, like, what are y'all doing? Oh my gosh. So you've heard people talk about boomers and like the boomer generation. Well, the boomer generation are babies born starting in 1946, as soon as the war ended. The war ended in 1945. There was a huge boom in when men came home and babies were born after the war ended. So starting in 1946 all the way up to like, I think 1964. I think like their flip-flop 46 to 64, I think is how they calculate the boomer generation. So people born all like in the late 40s and all through the 50s, their parents had grown up in the Depression and war era and were now living prosperous lives in the 50s and that were late 40s and early 50s and having babies. And so by the time these babies are in high school in the mid to late 60s, that's where the hippie culture came from. And that's where we have this sort of counterculture of unsupervised teenagers who are like free love, all this stuff. So I think it really caught their parents, the previous generation, off guard. As far as I think the previous generation is called the lost generation because they didn't really have a chance to develop a personality because they basically experienced poverty and war their whole growing up. So I think that's called the lost generation. But anyway, so this sort of boomer generation in the mid and late 60s, started experimenting with drugs and drinking, and there wasn't really being monitored. There weren't really laws about that, and so teen pregnancies exploded as a problem, and the access to birth control was a big issue, and people were getting back alley abortions because there weren't really abortions available. There's a lot of sort of pop culture and artistic analysis of this phenomenon. Think of Dirty Dancing it was set in the 60s, and she had a botched abortion, and Grease, there's Rizzo's afraid that she might be pregnant, and there's lots of sort of rampant sex and smoking and drinking in that movie as well. So that's sort of the culture that these novels that in this unit sort of sprang out of. And so the issues novel movement of the 1960s was this reactionary genre of literature for young people, where the adult generation, the parents and the teachers and social workers and people like that who were watching these young people in the 1960s, some of them screw up their lives irreparably through drugs and alcohol and premarital sex and getting pregnant in high school. It was just, what are y'all doing? What's happening? So this genre sort of, all kinds of books like this sort of popping up. Just books that deal with, drinking too early and drug use and premarital sex and abortion and all these different things. And so some of them were a little more touchy-feely than others. And we'll talk more when we read My Darling, My Hamburger and Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones. We'll talk more about the pregnancy side of it. But the first novel you had to read was A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, and it's mainly focuses on drugs, but also drinking, but drugs too. This is not the only one. This was just an example that I thought would be good because it's not that long. It's pretty short, and it has a lot of interesting cultural and historical context things to reveal to us. So that's the context of the genre that we're in right now, is where these novels started cropping up. So think about who's writing these novels. These novels are being written by adults. These are adults from the previous generation who are observing what young people in the mid-1960s are doing, and they're losing their minds. They're like, what's going on? How do we nip this in the bud? Our babies are having sex, and our babies are getting pregnant, and our babies are getting hooked on drugs, and I've never even seen drugs. I don't even know where you get them, and how are our babies getting drugs, And so a lot of these novels were written by concerned adults. The customers of these novels, the people who are buying them and wanting them to exist, were concerned parents and concerned teachers, and some of the people writing them were adults who were concerned about this development, this cultural development. So keep that in your mind when you're reading these books in this unit, that these were adults reacting to a certain cultural reality and producing these texts. The sort of next generation of the issues novel in the 1960s and they continued on into the 70s is once you got into the 80s and maybe early 90s, when TV was popular, these books that we're reading turned into the after school special. You've heard of, that's after school special stuff, where these shows would come on at 4:00 in the afternoon, and it would be these sort of episodes about it would depict students getting into trouble, getting drugs, or being lured into like a kidnapper's van, or a guy would be trying to pressure a girl to go further physically than she wants to, and these after school specials became a big thing on TV. So the TV version sort of took over for the novel version once we got into the 1980s and 90s. But in the 60s and 70s it was all about the books, still books that dealt with issues like this. So today we're going to focus on the ones about drugs. So Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich is not the only one, as I said, but it's an example. And when it came out, a lot of high school teachers read it and were very inspired by it, and they really related to Mr. Cohen and Mr. Green. I think the teachers, those are the teachers in there, and they really related to their situation. And they would, high school curriculum started assigning it as like a text for the students to read, or even not even if the students read it, but the teachers would have to read it for part of their job as like professional development to help them train how to deal with this new epidemic in their students. But there are examples, if you go back and look, that you can find old curriculums from the 60s and early 70s that for high school English classes that include Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich as, part of the reading. It's also been banned and challenged very frequently just because of the gratuitous drug use and things like that. And some of the language used in it, it's been challenged and banned as well. But, lots of good books have been banned and challenged. We've read Tom Sawyer and all that. This won't be the last time that, we've heard that. We'll hear that about a book, that it was a banned book. So let me tell you about this book specifically. So, let's see, do I have a copy? Yeah, here we go. Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich. That's the one you've read. Alice Childress. Let me tell you a little bit about her, because I think her background gives a clue to sort of the history of this book. So, Alice Childress was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1920. If you think about what was happening in 1920 was the Harlem Renaissance. So she was born during the Harlem Renaissance when it was first starting, and then her family, when she was little, I think not that little, she was elementary school age, they moved to New York, and she was raised mostly in Harlem from the time when she was a kid. So she considers herself to be from Harlem because she was raised in Harlem her whole life. She was a high school dropout. She never finished high school, but she got really involved in the theater culture. She started working in theaters in New York and writing plays and writing for the theater. Even though she never even finished high school, she just sort of had a gift for it, and she became pretty successful as a playwright. That seems to be a theme with children's lit. We have a lot of our authors, J.M. Barrie and our A. Milne and some Lewis Carroll. Not necessarily, he was friends with them, but he wasn't as popular of a playwright as they were. But that's a thing, that they would write plays and get into children's lit through the theater. Well, Alice Childress was similar. And so she was involved in this movement in the 60s and 70s called BAM, the Black Arts Movement. And the BAM, Black Arts Movement, was kind of a reimagining of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was in the 1920s, mostly, some in the 30s, 1920s and 30s. Then later, like the next generation had their own, sort of trying to recapture the artistic magic of the Harlem Renaissance, and it was called the Black Arts Movement. It involved poetry and dance and music and art and theater, and Alice Childress was involved in the Black Arts Movement in the theater world. Well, when, culturally the things were happening that I just discussed, she was approached by her publisher, to write a book for young people about drugs. Right? They wanted a book about drugs that addressed the plight of inner city youth and the drug epidemic that was plaguing inner city youth. And they thought she would do a good job. So it was almost like commissioned. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. She didn't set out to be like, I'm going to write a book that helps tell people about teenagers on drugs. She did not conceive of this idea. She was approached and asked to write a book for teenagers that depicted, gratuitous drug use and how to overcome that. So I think that is key, because it sort of suggests certain motivations she had, characters that exist in the novel, which we can talk about the actual characters when we are talking live on our Discord feed. We can talk about characters you like and things about them. But the history of how this novel came about, I think, is significant to showing how, like, what her motivations were for writing it. So some key things about this book. One is sort of the mixed medium that it uses. Like, there's newspaper clippings and advertisements and things like that throughout. We'll see that again when we read My Darling, My Hamburger. It has newspaper clippings and notes and things like that in it too. It's very similar. But Here Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich has this sort of mixed media. Another one is the changing perspective from each character throughout the novel. And so that helps us pinpoint a little bit more closely how exactly unreliable Benji is. Because Benji is, I mean, he's an unreliable narrator. We kind of meet him, and we meet him first, and we don't know that we shouldn't necessarily believe him. But then the more people we meet throughout the novel, we understand, oh, this is an addict. He's talking to us like an addict would talk to us, right? So the different perspectives. But I also wanted to draw your attention to the use of language, the use of dialogue. So there's a couple things with that. One is that this book really juxtaposes an internal monologue versus an external presentation, right? So we get the internal monologue of some of these characters, but then we also get representation of how they present themselves to others. And so Childress is really sort of toying with the differences there, and even how a young person is figuring all that out. What they think inside their mind versus what they feel like they can say when adults are present, or when other people that they don't trust perhaps are present. So that's something she's doing with the internal processing of our thoughts versus the external presentation of our thoughts and opinions. Something else is the dialect. You might have noticed it's a little bit difficult to read at first because of she is representing the sort of vernacular of the inner city youth in the 1960s, right? Definitely this very urban minority dialect, right, of the inner city. And so she's representing it phonetically on the page. And some authors during the Harlem Renaissance did that, and that was another thing that a lot of Black arts movement authors did. But A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich is kind of unique in the sense that it's one of the first, definitely the first for young people. It's one of the first children's novels to represent the vernacular in that way, but not just in dialogue, but in the narrator. So we're used to having a narrator of a story who's just a sort of static presence. Like, the narrative voice is indistinguishable. It doesn't have an accent. It doesn't have a personality. It's just this cultureless voice is the narrator, right? Well, in Here Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, the narrator dips into and speaks with that cultural vernacular, that sort of dialect that the characters use. And depending on which character is being discussed, like Mr. Cohen is a white person, and so the voice is a little bit different. Mr. Green is sort of this activist character, but he's very educated, so his voice is, and the vocabulary he uses is a bit different. And Benji's trying to be impressive on the street, so like his dialect is a little bit different. So if you have already read it, or if you haven't really been paying attention to that, start paying attention to the use of dialect, not just in dialogue in the book, but also the narrator adopts that vernacular, and that is very new and progressive for this time. For this book is one of the very first that did that. Definitely the first for kids books to do that. So be paying attention to the use of language. Some other themes I guess we could talk about live, but it's real easy in a children's book to pay attention to the children, and we meet Benji first, and he's on the cover, and it's his whole story, right? But I want to make sure we also pay attention to the adults in this novel. I've mentioned the teachers a couple times and what the teachers' roles are in this story, and a lot of you are going to become teachers, so that might be something you want to zoom in on and focus on. But there's also his stepdad character who like plays a huge part. Maybe spoiler alert, I don't know, but I'm convinced that this story is really the stepdad, Robert, I think his name. I always forget his name. I think it's Robert. I really think that it is. It's gonna bother me. I'm pretty sure it's Robert. No, I can't find it. Oh, it doesn't matter. But I'm pretty sure that it's, like, in my opinion, it is. He's the main character of the story. He's the one. Why did I say Robert? Is that his dad? Butler. It's Butler. Butler Craig. Yeah. Who's Robert? Was that his first dad? Anyway, y'all are seeing me not remember a name right here on this video. But his dad, Butler Craig. And I feel like it's sort of his story. He's the one who's making the decision to step up. He's the one who's making the decision to be the dad here. He's the one who never gives up on Benji. Ultimately, like he has periods of doubt and gets angry, but he's the one at the end who's waiting on the curb, hoping Benji will show up to rehab and to his meetings and stuff. So maybe it's because I'm a parent, but I really hone in on Butler's character in this novel. It's kind of, he's the one who sort of evolves into himself and steps up and becomes like the man of the house. But it's definitely, also a story depicting teenage drug use and the plights of that, and sort of all the different resources available to him, because he talks to a social worker and he talks to different teachers at school, and he has his mom, he has his grandma who prays for him and tries to cast demons out of him. He has his best friend who's trying to dissuade him from going down this road. He has drug dealers who are trying to convince him to go down this road, and that's a completely normal thing, right? So the readers of the book, depending on who's talking, drug use, especially even just casual drug use or even frequent drug use, is a normal thing that everybody's doing now, or it's this horrible thing from the devil, or it's this sort of cultural carryover, a generational behavior, just depending on who's talking. So whereas Alice Childress was commissioned to write a book for teens about drugs, I think she did way above and beyond what was commissioned of her. I think she really had a lot more things to say about not just what happens when teens get on drugs, but also just sort of the family dynamic of minority inner city youth, and the expectations of masculinity. We have all different kinds of representations of masculinity, and specifically minority masculinity in this text, and what a black man should be, essentially, and what a black man is, what society expects of him, and how Butler and others in here transcend that expectation. So it's a lot more meaty than just there's a teen on drugs, even though that is definitely a part of it. So we will talk about more specific passages and characters and some of the things like that, plot points, in the Discord feed. And when I send this video in the message, I'm going to link in a YouTube video, which I normally show in class. And it is a clip. They made a movie sometime in the 1970s. I forget the year. I think 73 maybe. They made a movie of A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich. And I found a clip on YouTube that's a few minutes long, maybe 6 or 7 minutes long. And it's the first time when they go to Tiger's house for the first time, and Benji he gets his first hit ever, skin pop or whatever, of drugs. And so there's a couple reasons why I showed this clip. One is so that you can kind of get you can hear the dialect they use. You can hear the language, and reading it on the page is a little bit difficult at first until you get used to it. So maybe the clip will help you hear it. And it'll also let you visualize this kind of key no turning back moment. He had so many chances to say no. When Jimmy Lee was trying to get him not to go, and when he got there and they felt weird, and there's all these different reasons he could have turned back, but he didn't. And so in that clip, the clip has a couple things like that you can see. One other thing about the dialect that I didn't mention a while ago, which I meant to, that I wanted you to realize was that when I was growing up, there was this whole big thing about ebonics. Everybody talked about ebonics, right? And so I guess that would have been in the 90s, 80s, late 80s, mostly in the 90s, late 80s and early 90s. There was this movement to sort of recognize ebonics, which is a colloquialism for ebony phonics. Ebonics, ebony phonics. That was the slang term for the dialect, but the official linguistic name for the Ebonics dialect is BEV, Black English Vernacular. Some people prefer to make it more politically correct, and I've seen it as AAEV, African American English Vernacular, abbreviated like that. But mostly people call it BEV, Black English Vernacular. And it is recognized as an official dialect of English. So a dialect is not its own language on its own, but it's an offshoot of a language that has slightly different grammar and slightly different vocabulary. Usually it maintains all of the original grammar and maybe one or two extra grammar rules, or it has alternate vocabulary words here and there, or some extra vocabulary words. So it's more than just an accent. It's an actual changing of the structure and alternate structures in some places. So the most recognizable element of BEV is the extra verb tense, the durative BE. Quotation right here. Let me write it on a thing. This is going on a little bit longer than I thought. Whoa, I just dropped my phone. Did you hear that? I have a whiteboard. So can you see that? The durative B, duration. It's a state of being, like the am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. The state of being, verbs. But the durative be is like a verb tense that's actually very useful. It shows duration, like that something is ongoing. Because we have, past, present, and future, and present perfect and past perfect and all of that. But the durative tense shows duration, like instead of it is hot, it be hot. Like you hear people say that now as slang, or it she all the time be trifling. You hear people say that. I sound completely white when I'm saying it, I know, and probably very cringy, but a lot of people adopt the durative be as a slang speech, but it's actually an alternate or an additional verb tense in BEV, Black English Vernacular, the showing duration. And it's not just something that currently is, like it is hot, or it was hot, like it was hot yesterday. It be hot. It stay being hot. That means it has been hot for a while, and the hotness is in duration, right? It's carrying on, and so it's a pretty useful verb tense, but it's not part of standard English usage. So that's just interesting to me. So but the point is, I wanted to point out this novel came out upside down before the sort of BEV campaign in the late 80s and early 90s, and mostly in the 90s. The BEV campaign to get it recognized as an official recognized dialect of English, that was after this. So she's very sort of progressive in her use of the sort of urban dialect that her narrator and all her characters use in the novel. So it was a little bit of extra few minutes that I didn't mean to add on here, but it's worth it. I meant to say it and forgot. Okay, so in the Discord, we'll talk about certain characters, and we'll talk about passages that maybe you liked, and I'll put a link to that YouTube video of the movie so you can watch, just a few minutes long, and you can watch that so you can get a sound for like how they're talking. And then when we meet in Discord, if you can, maybe mark a passage or two that you would like. You just put a page number and you in the feed, and we can look at it and talk about it. If there's an interesting one, or a character, or a scene, or something that you think we should talk about. Okay, until then, y'all have a good rest of your weekend, and I will see you Tuesday.